The rain in Portland did not fall so much as it descended a slow, relentless gray curtain that had been drawing itself across the city since before midnight and showed no interest in stopping. It was the kind of rain that soaked through wool coats and crept under collar lines and found the back of your neck with quiet, patient precision. It was the kind of rain that made the city look like it was being erased one block at a time from the edges inward. Dara Osei stepped out of the rideshare at 6:47 in the morning and did not bother to run. She had learned a long time ago that running from rain only meant you arrived somewhere damp and breathless. She pulled the hood of her navy blue sweatshirt up over her natural hair, which was pulled back in a simple puff, already beginning to show the effects of the flight and the long cab from PDX, and she walked. She walked the way she always walked, with her weight settled, her shoulders low, her pace unhurried and purposeful. Not the walk of someone who was late, the walk of someone who was exactly on time, because she had decided that this moment, this particular Tuesday morning at this particular hour, was exactly when she needed to be here. She was wearing leggings, running shoes with a worn-down left heel, the navy hoodie oversized belonging to her younger sister, and borrowed so long ago it had effectively become hers. She carried a single bag, a black canvas tote, functional and plain. The strap worn smooth at the shoulder, and inside it, nestled between a laptop and a manila folder. Fat with 11 months of work was a concealed recording device the size of a lipstick case already running, and a sealed federal indictment with the name Dale Pruitt on 3 of its 7 counts. She had an 8 a.m. appointment with Captain Gerald Mast of Portland Police Bureau's 6th Precinct. It was 6:47. She had arrived 73 minutes early on purpose. People who knew Dara Osei, the colleagues who had watched her prosecute a Chicago narcotics ring at 31, the attorneys who had faced her across courtrooms in 3 states and lost the deputy AG who had recommended her name to the White House for the Western District appointment, they would have understood immediately what 73 minutes early meant. It meant she was not arriving for a meeting. She was arriving for reconnaissance. The rumors about the 6th Precinct had been circulating inside federal oversight networks for the better part of 3 years. Quietly, the way bad things in police departments always circulate a word here, a complaint buried there, a statistic that looked wrong in a quarterly report, but not wrong enough to trigger a formal review until someone with enough authority decided to look directly at it instead of around it. The complaints from Portland's historically black neighborhoods in the north and northeast of the city described a narcotics unit that seemed to arrest people, not based on evidence, but based on proximity. Proximity to a corner, proximity to a face, proximity to a demographic. The evidence room at the 6th had a higher discrepancy rate than any precinct in the Pacific Northwest. 3 internal affairs complaints filed against Officer Dale Pruitt in the previous 4 years had each been administratively resolved without formal discipline. Dara had read every word of every document her office had assembled. She had spent 11 months building a federal case from the outside in accumulating evidence with a kind of patient ferocity that her colleagues described always admiringly, and sometimes with a little fear, as the thing that made her different. She did not prosecute people she thought were probably guilty. She prosecuted people she could prove were guilty, and she waited as long as it took to make that proof so complete, so airtight, so densely documented that no defense attorney on earth could find a thread to pull. The indictment in her bag had been ready for 9 days. She had waited because she wanted to see the precinct the way it actually functioned, not polished and stiff for a federal visitor, not warned and rehearsed, and presenting its best face but raw and ordinary and unguarded. She wanted to walk into its daily life and let it show her who it was before she showed it who she was. She was not dressed the way a United States attorney was expected to dress. That was also on purpose. Dara had graduated summa cum laude from Howard University before Harvard Law School. She had clerked for a federal appellate judge. She had spent 8 years as an assistant U.S. attorney prosecuting complex, organized crime cases before being appointed to lead the full office. She owned suits that had cost more than some people's monthly rent. She had a closet in her DC apartment that her sister liked to describe as aggressively put together. None of that was in Portland today. Portland today was the hoodie and the leggings and the running shoes and the bag on her shoulder and the recording device running and the rain falling on the hood pulled up over her hair. That was all Portland today needed to see. She crossed the wet sidewalk toward the 6th Precinct's front entrance and paused for exactly 1 second at the base of the steps looking up at the building. It was a brutalist concrete structure built in the 1970s, designed in the architectural philosophy that suggested public institutions should feel slightly threatening from the outside. It had the look of a place that took itself very seriously and had never questioned whether it deserved to. Dara took a breath of cold, rain-wet Portland air. Then she went inside. The lobby of the 6th Precinct smelled exactly the way she had expected it to smell: stale drip coffee and floor wax, and the faint underlying note of industrial cleaning solution that never quite masked the other things that happened in buildings like this one. The fluorescent lighting was the color of a headache, and it buzzed very faintly in a frequency that Dara suspected most people stopped consciously noticing after the first week and never noticed again. The front reception desk, a high counter of laminated wood with a scarred surface and a spinning rack of community information pamphlets, was unmanned. Dara stood in front of it for a moment. She checked the clock mounted on the lobby wall, 6:51 a.m., and then she made a quiet mental note and moved on. The front desk of a functioning police precinct left unmanned during a shift overlap on a weekday morning. Strike one. She had been told during the 11 months of building this case that the 6th was a well-run house. That was the phrase Captain Mast had used in his most recent peer review, a document she had read 3 times. A well-run house. She had noticed even then that the phrase was written in passive voice. The precinct was well-run. Not I run it well. Not here is what we do. Just the house is well-run. The language of a man who had learned to describe a place without describing himself. She moved through the lobby toward the interior access gate, a chest-height swinging panel with a keypad lock and a badge reader on a metal post. The gate was propped open with a fire extinguisher. The bright red cylinder sat wedged against the base of the gate at a casual angle, as if it had been placed there recently and casually by someone who simply found the gate inconvenient and had no particular concern about who might walk through it. Dara looked at the fire extinguisher for a moment. She thought about what it meant, not just as a security failure in isolation, but as a symptom. A front desk that no one was required to staff at shift change. A security gate that officers had grown comfortable propping open because walking around it was mildly annoying. These were not dramatic failures. They were the kind of small accumulated negligences that happened when a place stopped believing that oversight applied to it. Strike two. She walked through the propped gate, her sneakers squeaking very softly on the linoleum, and navigated the hallway using the hand-drawn floor diagram she had memorized from the precinct's public records filing. The bulletin boards along the corridor were the reading material of institutional complacency, yellowed flyers for a union fundraiser from 2 years ago, an updated departmental use of force policy that someone had printed hole-punched and hung crookedly without reading. She passed a corkboard labeled Commendations in block letters that held 7 plaques, none of them dated within the last 18 months. She found the office marked Captain E. Mast, 6th Precinct without difficulty. The door was ajar. The lights were off inside, but the blinds were half open, letting in the gray morning light in long, pale stripes across the floor and the surface of the desk. She pushed the door open gently, looked inside, and stepped in. The office was the office of a man who had occupied it long enough to stop seeing it. There were framed photographs on the wall and on the credenza behind the desk. Mast shaking hands with the mayor. Mast at a precinct barbecue. A group photo of a precinct basketball team from 2019. There were commendation plaques mounted at slightly different angles as if added over time without anyone ever stepping back to check the alignment. There was a coffee mug on the desk that had not been cleaned recently. There was a legal notepad with a handwritten schedule that she could read from where she stood near the doorway. She stepped fully inside, set her bag carefully on the chair nearest the door, and began to move around the room with quiet, methodical attention. She was not rifling through drawers. She was not accessing anything that was not already in plain view. She was an officer of the federal government who had lawful authority to be present in this building and lawful purpose for what she was observing. She examined the framed commendations. She read the dates. She looked at the photo of Mast and the mayor and thought about the particular way powerful men smiled in photographs with other powerful men, the smile that said, "We are the same kind of person, and we do not need to explain that to each other." She picked up a framed photo from the credenza. Mast and 4 officers, all of them white, all of them in uniform, all of them holding beer bottles at what appeared to be a retirement party. She looked at the faces. She located Dale Pruitt in the back row. Immediately, she had studied his service photograph many times. He was larger in person than his official portrait suggested or would be, and even in a casual photograph, he held himself with the particular posture of a man who was accustomed to being the biggest physical presence in a room and who had arranged his life around the advantages that provided. She set the photograph back. She was not snooping, she was cataloging. She was building with each observation the portrait of an institution that had looked the other way long enough that it had forgotten what it was supposed to be looking at. She moved to the daily roster tacked to a corkboard near the window and found Pruitt's name clocked in at 6:15 a.m. Already in the building, already somewhere. The recording device in her bag was capturing everything. Strike 3. An unlocked, unoccupied office belonging to the commanding officer of a major metropolitan police precinct, accessible to anyone who walked in from the unmonitored lobby through the propped gate in the hallway. A precinct where the actual captain had apparently not thought it necessary to lock his door when he left. Dara picked up a framed photograph of Mast shaking hands with the Portland City Council chair at a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a community policing initiative. She held it for a moment, tilting it slightly in the pale morning light. Then she heard the voice from the doorway. "Make yourself at home, why don't you?" The voice was a growl. Low and grating, and immediately deliberately hostile, the voice of a man who had spent a long time using tone as the first instrument of control, deploying it the way some people deploy a hand on a shoulder as a claim of authority before a single fact has been established. It was not a question. It was a statement dressed as one, and the particular pleasure in it came from the fact that the speaker already believed he knew what he was looking at and had already decided what to do about it. Dara turned around slowly. Standing in the doorway was a man who occupied more of it than most men could. He was heavyset, not simply large, but carrying a particular kind of weight that accumulates on a body that has spent decades doing physical work and then stopped the muscle underneath softened, but the frame still imposing. His uniform was fitted to a version of himself from several years ago, straining slightly across the gut and the shoulders. His face was flushed not from exertion, but from the particular permanent flush of broken capillaries across the nose and cheeks that came from blood pressure or too many evenings at a bar or both. His hair was a gray-tinged buzz cut that had grown unevenly longer on the sides than the top, as if his barber appointments had become inconsistent. His name tag read D. Pruitt/Senior Officer. He was holding a large styrofoam cup of coffee, and he had not stopped walking when he spoke. He stepped into the room without invitation, without pausing at the threshold to assess whether he should enter, because the idea that the answer might be no had apparently not occurred to him. He was a man who entered rooms. He looked at Dara the way a certain kind of man had been looking at Dara her entire adult life, slowly from the bottom up, landing briefly on each detail as if cataloging evidence: the worn running shoes, the leggings, the oversized navy hoodie with the hood still partially up, the natural hair in its simple puff, and finally her face, which she had arranged into an expression of patient, professional calm. His eyes finished the scan and then narrowed very slightly. He had completed his assessment. She could see it happen. She could see the conclusion being reached and filed and acted upon in the span of 2 seconds. She had seen that look thousands of times, in courtrooms and hallways and airports and parking garages. The look that said, "I have already decided what you are, and the only question now is whether you're going to be easy or difficult about it." "Good morning," Dara said. Her voice was level and professional, the voice she used in courtrooms when she was being careful to give nothing away. She placed the photograph back on the credenza gently and faced him. "I'm waiting for Captain Mast." Pruitt stepped further into the room. He didn't walk so much as encroach, using the architecture of his body, its sheer volume, to gradually reduce the space available for anyone else. He looked around the office as if confirming a suspicion, and then brought his gaze back to her with a particular expression that combined contempt and amusement in equal measure. He took a slow sip of his coffee, never breaking eye contact, establishing the rhythm of this interaction from the beginning. "Captain's not in," he said. "And he doesn't take meetings with civilians before 8, especially not ones who wander in off the street." "I have an appointment," Dara said. "Sure you do." The laugh that followed was dry and short, devoid of any warmth. "Just like the guy in cell 3 has an appointment with the governor." "Let me guess." He took another sip of coffee, looking her up and down again with deliberate slowness. "Here to file a complaint? Or maybe somebody you know got picked up last night and you're here to tell me what a good person they are." Dara felt the familiar tightening in her chest, not panic, not fear, but the cold internal compression of a specific kind of anger that she had learned to metabolize efficiently. It was the anger that came from being perfectly clear about who you were and watching someone decide it didn't matter. She had felt it many times. She had learned to use it the way a fire uses oxygen, quietly and completely, and in service of something larger than the immediate moment. She did not allow a single trace of it to reach her face. "I'm not here for any of that," she said. "I'm here for a federal review. If you could let the captain know I'm here when he arrives, federal review." He cut her off, and the mockery in his voice had sharpened into something with an edge. He stepped closer, 2 steps enough to reduce the distance between them to a point where it required deliberate composure not to step back. The smell of stale coffee reached her, and under it the faint ghost of tobacco and the chemical sweetness of a mint that hadn't succeeded in covering either. He pointed a thick finger at her chest, not touching but close. "You expect me to believe that you—" He gestured at her with the coffee cup, a dismissive sweep that encompassed the hoodie, the hair, all of her, Ara fed. "Officer," she began. "Get out." He said it flatly, the amusement gone, now replaced by the blunt authority of a man who was done with the preamble. "This is a restricted office. I don't know how you got past the front desk." The irony of this was so complete it nearly made her close her eyes. "But you're leaving now." "I have lawful authority to be present in this building," Dara said. She kept her voice steady and clear. Not loud, not combative, just factual, the way you state a statute in a brief. "My name is Dara Osei. I am the United States Attorney for the Western District of Oregon." Pruitt stared at her. The silence lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then he threw his head back and laughed, a genuine barking laugh, the kind that filled a room and was designed to fill a room, designed to demonstrate the total absence of any concern about what she had just said. United States Attorney. He said it the way you might repeat a punchline to make sure everyone had heard it. He turned toward the hallway. "Hey, Feld, get in here a minute." Footsteps in the hallway, and then a young officer appeared at the door. He was lanky in his uniform, with the earnest, slightly unfinished look of someone who had been out of the academy for less than a year and was still in the process of learning how much he didn't know. His name tag read C. Feld, and his expression as he took in the scene. Pruitt's amusement. The woman in the hoodie standing with quiet stillness near the credenza was a mixture of confusion and the particular discomfort of someone who suspects they have walked into something they're going to wish they hadn't. "What's going on, Dale?" This woman, Pruitt said, gesturing at Dara with his coffee cup in the manner of someone indicating a mildly interesting exhibit, claims she's the United States Attorney. Says she's here for a federal review. He spread the phrase out slowly, letting the absurdity of it breathe. Caught her in the captain's office looking through his things. Feld looked at Dara. His expression was uncertain in a way that told her he was not at his core. A bad person, just a young one, who had not yet developed the habit of acting on his uncertainty when a 22-year senior officer was standing next to him, radiating absolute certainty in the other direction. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "do you have ID?" Dara reached for her bag on the chair. She moved slowly and deliberately, narrating her intention as she did so. "My credentials are in the hands." Pruitt's voice snapped across the room like a cable under tension. His right hand dropped to his hip, not drawing, but landing on the holster with the finality of a declaration. "Don't you reach into that bag." Dara stopped, held still. She looked at Pruitt and then briefly at Feld, who had gone rigid in the doorway. The atmosphere had shifted. It had crossed from rude and dismissive into something with actual physical weight. A man with a hand on a holster in a small room. A false charge already called in on the radio. The math was not complicated. "Officer," she said, and she used a careful, deliberate calm, the calm of someone managing a situation rather than reacting to it. "My federal credentials are in the front pocket of this bag. I am reaching for them slowly, and I am telling you that in advance. I am not a threat. I don't care what you say is in there," Pruitt said. He stepped between her and the bag with the fluid authority of someone who had been doing this for 22 years, who had spent 2 decades moving his body into spaces to claim them. "You're acting suspicious. You're in a restricted space without authorization. Step away from the bag and put your hands on your head." "Officer Pruitt." She said his name for the first time, and she said it calmly and precisely. "You are making a career-ending mistake." The words landed, and he heard them, and she saw the flicker, the smallest, briefest suggestion that some deep, self-preserving instinct in him had registered a signal it could not quite identify. And then the arrogance closed over it like water over a stone, and the flicker was gone, and what replaced it was the expression of a man who had spent 2 decades learning that statements like that meant nothing in rooms like this one. "The only mistake I made," he said, and there was something almost satisfied in his voice. The satisfaction of a man who has reduced a situation to its familiar shape was not cuffing you the moment I walked in. He unclipped his radio from his belt. "Dispatch, this is Pruitt at 6th. I'm in the captain's office. I have a female civilian trespassing in a restricted area claiming federal credentials. Charge her with 1,031 trespassing and impersonating a federal officer. Send a female officer to the captain's office for a pat-down." He clipped the radio back and looked at her with a flat, complete authority. "Turn around." Feld in the doorway opened his mouth. "Dale, maybe we should just Feld." Pruitt's voice was a door closing. "I've been doing this 22 years. I know what I'm looking at." He looked at Dara again with the final assessment of a man who had completed his analysis and was now simply executing the conclusion. Prosecutors wear suits. They drive cars. They don't show up soaking wet in a hoodie at 7 in the morning like they came off a park bench. Turn around. There was a particular quality to the moment before Dara turned around, a quality she would think about later in the quiet of her office after the day had resolved into documentation and debrief. It was the quality of a decision made very clearly and held very steadily. She was turning around because fighting him physically would be dangerous and purposeless and would undermine everything she had come here to do. She was turning around because the recording device in her bag was capturing every word he had said, and the words were worth more than any argument she could make in the next 10 minutes. She was turning around because she had spent 11 months building something that was about to open underneath Dale Pruitt like a trapdoor, and all she needed was a few more minutes for the floor to fully give way. She turned around, laced her fingers behind her head, stared at the beige wall. Behind her, she could hear Pruitt breathing heavier than it should have been for a man who had simply walked across a room. She could hear the creak of his duty belt. She could hear Feld shifting his weight in the doorway, the sound of a young man in profound and growing discomfort. Quinn Feld, Pruitt corrected, catching the wrong rookie's name check that bag. Dale. Feld's voice was quieter now, a genuinely uncertain whisper. If she actually is. She ain't. Pruitt's voice was absolute. Look at her. Does she look like a federal prosecutor to you? There was a pause, and in that pause, Dara heard something in Feld's silence that she filed carefully. The silence of a young man who was looking at her and thinking that maybe actually she carried herself like someone who might be exactly what she said she was, and who was too afraid to say so out loud. The sound of a zipper. Feld was going through her bag. I see a laptop, Feld said. Some files. His voice shifted, took on a different quality. There's a badge case here, Fake Pruitt said immediately. Immediately and with complete confidence, the confidence of a man who has already decided and is now simply managing the evidence to fit the decision. You can get those online. What else? It looks. Feld's voice had gone quiet in a way that suggested he was reading it very carefully. Seal. Dale, it says, Department of Justice, United States Attorney, Dara Osei. A pause, then the sound of Pruitt's heavy footsteps crossing the carpet, the sound of the badge case being taken. See? His voice had found a new register, a triumphant, sneering tone that was uglier than the hostile one had been, somehow, because it was the voice of someone enjoying this. Look at the lamination. And the photograph probably photoshopped. You can have these made. I've seen it before. He raised his voice toward her back. What are you actually doing here, intel for somebody? You working with someone on the inside? Dara spoke to the wall. Her voice was precise and level. That is a federal credential. Tampering with it is a felony. Detaining a federal officer without lawful cause is a felony. I have identified myself clearly, and I am telling you for the final time that you are accumulating charges against yourself at a rate that should concern you significantly. She heard him move fast with the practiced aggression of a man who had decided that the situation called for it. And then his hand was on her shoulder, and he spun her around, and the force of it was sharp and unnecessary enough to send a spike of pain through her shoulder joint. And then his face was very close to hers, and he was speaking in a low, hissing voice with something beneath the anger that was older and uglier and had nothing to do with the law. You listen to me, he said, and spittle flecked the air between them. You don't have rights in here. Not until I say you do. You come into my house, you disrespect this badge, and you think lying about who you are is going to protect you. He stepped back, reached for his handcuffs, his jaw set and his eyes flat and certain. I'm booking you for trespassing, resisting, and impersonating a federal officer. You're going to spend the rest of today in holding, and then we'll see how high and mighty you feel when your story falls apart. Feld tried once more. Quietly, desperately. The captain gets in at 8. If there's even a chance, Feld. One word. Final. The handcuffs came out. The walk through the bullpen was the part that burned, not the pain in her shoulder from when he had spun her, though that was real and present, a deep ache in the joint that she was managing by keeping her breathing slow and even. Not the bite of the handcuffs, which he had closed one notch tighter than necessary, which she suspected was not an accident. Not even the fundamental furious indignity of being marched in restraints through a police precinct when she was the United States Attorney and the building she was being marched through was currently operating under a federal investigation that she was leading. It was the faces, The 6th Precinct's morning shift was filtering in officers in various states of arrival, some in full uniform, some in civilian clothes, heading toward the locker rooms, some carrying coffee, some logging in at workstations. They stopped when she and Pruitt entered the bullpen. Some stopped because the sight of a senior officer with a prisoner naturally pulled attention. Some stopped for longer when they registered her, the hoodie, the handcuffs, the calm, straight-backed walk, the absence of any expression of guilt or fear on her face. Some looked away, looked down at their keyboards or their coffee cups or their phones. Some smirked. An officer passing in the opposite direction holding a paper bag from the donut shop 2 blocks over caught Pruitt's eye and raised his chin, caught another one. Dale and Pruitt's voice behind her was expansive and cheerful as he said, "Live one. Tried to tell me she was the United States attorney. Can you believe that?" And the officer laughed a short, certain laugh and kept walking. Dara memorized faces. It was not a decision, it was a professional reflex, the same reflex that had served her in courtrooms for 15 years. She memorized the officer with the donut bag. She memorized the one who smirked. She memorized the one who looked away too quickly. The one who stared a half-second too long. The one who had the decency to look specifically and privately troubled. She was building a list, and the list was a kind of promise. Pruitt directed her toward the elevator at the far end of the bullpen, the elevator that led down to the basement processing area and holding cells. He pressed the button with a kind of casual finality. The elevator hummed distantly. He leaned close to her ear. His voice was very low, private for her alone. "You people are all the same," he said. "Always got an angle. Always got a story. In here, though, the story doesn't matter. In here, you're nothing." The recording device in her bag caught every word. The elevator arrived. The doors opened with a soft mechanical chime. And Pruitt looked up. Standing inside the elevator were 3 people. The man in the center was Captain Gerald Mast's crisp white shirt, the 4 gold stars of his rank on his collar, his silver hair combed, his expression carrying the particular mid-conversation lightness of a man in the middle of a pleasant discussion. He was turned slightly toward the person on his left, still completing a thought, still in the residue of a smile. To his left stood a man Dara recognized immediately, FBI Special Agent in Charge Marcus Webb. Dark suit precisely fitted. The kind of quiet authority that people with real power learn to carry without announcing it. His federal credentials were clipped to his belt. He was looking at his phone and had been until the elevator doors opened. To Mast's right, a woman with a stenographer's pad. All 3 of them looked up at the same moment. Mast's eyes found Dara's face first. They traveled from her face to her hands, the handcuffs to Pruitt standing behind her with the particular stance of a man who had just done something he was proud of. The residue of the smile left Mast's face the way warmth leaves a room when a window breaks. His face did not become angry. It became pale. It became the face of a man watching in real time the worst possible version of a thing he had told himself would never happen. Marcus Webb lowered his phone. He looked at Dara. His expression in anyone else it might have been described as stunned. In Marcus Webb, who did not permit himself the full expression of stunned, it was a particular quality of stillness, a careful and absolute stillness that he held for precisely 2 seconds before he stepped forward out of the elevator. "Ms. Osei," Webb said, and his voice was completely level and completely controlled, and it carried the weight of a man who was choosing each word with deliberate precision, because he understood that this moment was being recorded by the building's cameras, by the witnesses in the bullpen, who had turned at the sound of the elevator, by the recording device in her bag that he knew about, because he had reviewed its operational parameters 48 hours before she walked through the front door. "Are you all right?" Dara straightened, despite the handcuffs, despite the aching shoulder, despite the 20 officers who had just watched her be walked through the bullpen. She straightened in the way she had straightened in every courtroom she had ever entered, with the absolute certainty of someone who knew exactly where she stood and exactly what she was doing there. "Good morning, Agent Webb," she said. "I'm fine. I apologize for the attire. My luggage was lost at PDX. I came directly from the airport." She looked at Pruitt, not past him, not through him, but directly at him, with the specific, clear-eyed gaze she used in cross-examination when she wanted a witness to understand that she was looking at them carefully, and that what she saw was not impressing her. "I believe Captain Mast and I had a scheduled meeting." The sound that followed was not silence in the ordinary sense. Ordinary silence is the absence of noise. What filled the bullpen of the 6th Precinct in the next 3 seconds was something else. It was the presence of comprehension arriving in a room like weather. It was the sound of 20 people simultaneously understanding something, each at their own speed, each with their own specific shade of horror. Pruitt's voice came from behind her, and it had changed. The expansive, cheerful confidence was gone. What replaced it was a tentative, reaching sound, a man who had been standing on what he believed was solid ground and was now feeling it shift. "Cap, I caught her in your office. She was going through your things. She claimed to be uncuff her." Mast's voice was very quiet and very contained in the way that things are contained when they are on the verge of not being contained at all. He had not moved from the elevator doorway. He was looking at Pruitt with an expression that Dara, watching from the front, could not fully see, but could reconstruct from the way it landed on Pruitt's face. Uncuff her. Right now. Pruitt? Cap, she was in the restricted. Pruitt was still talking, still trying to construct the narrative, still somewhere in his head, believing that the right arrangement of words might make this resolve into something manageable. "She didn't have any ID on her. I followed protocol. The credential she had was Dale." Mast's voice cracked slightly on the name. Not with emotion, with the particular strain of a man who is controlling something enormous by clenching very hard. "That is the United States Attorney for the Western District of Oregon. She is leading the federal corruption task force that this precinct has been cooperating with. Remove the handcuffs from her wrists." The silence that followed was different again. This was the silence of a thing breaking. Pruitt reached for the key on his belt. He found it. He brought it toward the handcuff lock. And then, in front of every officer in the bullpen of the 6th Precinct, in front of the FBI special agent in charge, and the captain and the stenographer, and the 20 witnesses who would remember this morning for the rest of their careers, Dale Pruitt's hand shook, and the key slipped from his fingers, and it hit the linoleum floor with a small, bright ringing sound that carried the entire length of the hallway. Marcus Webb moved with the efficient calm of someone who has prepared for a scenario and is now executing the preparation. He retrieved the key from the floor without drama, without comment, without a look in Pruitt's direction. He unlocked the handcuffs with 2 practiced turns of his wrist and removed them from Dara's wrists as carefully as if the act of removal itself was something that needed to be done precisely. Dara brought her arms forward and stood still for a moment, with her wrists against her chest looking at them. The marks were already deepening red welts, the precise width of steel handcuff bracelets pressed into her dark skin at both wrists, where Pruitt had closed them too tight. She looked at them the way she looked at evidence. She was documenting them. She was noting their depth and their color, and the location of the slight abrasion on the left wrist where the metal had shifted during the walk through the bullpen. She looked up. Captain Gerald Mast was still standing at the elevator door, and he looked like a man who had aged 10 years in the time it took an elevator to open. He looked like a man who was doing the very specific math of a very bad morning, calculating consequences, tracing blame, measuring the distance between where he was standing and where he needed to get to before he could call any of this contained. He opened his mouth. "Ms. Osei," he started. "I want you to know that this is not," Captain Dara said, and her voice was not unkind, but it was not soft. "I would like to have our meeting in the bullpen. The open one, with your officers present." Mast blinked. Whatever he had been preparing to say rearranged itself behind his eyes. Of course, he said, because there was nothing else he could say. Dara turned to face the bullpen. 20 officers in various stages of their interrupted morning routines were looking at her. Some of them were looking at her the way people look at something that has suddenly become very different from what they thought it was. Some of them were looking at Pruitt, who stood slightly behind and to her left, and whose face had completed its journey through the color spectrum and had arrived at a particular gray-white that was the face of a man whose body was responding to a threat his conscious mind had not yet caught up to processing. She did not raise her voice. She had never needed to raise her voice to fill a room. "I came to this precinct early this morning," she said, "to observe its operation before my scheduled meeting with Captain Mast. In my first 12 minutes in this building, I identified 3 federal compliance failures. The front reception desk was unoccupied during a shift overlap. The interior security gate was propped open with a fire extinguisher, and the commanding officer's office was unlocked and accessible to anyone who walked in." She paused. "I walked in. The room was completely still. I identified myself to Officer Pruitt 4 separate times. I stated my name, my title, and my federal badge number. I offered my credentials from my bag. Officer Pruitt refused to verify those credentials, refused to allow me to produce them, classified a lawful federal document as a prop, and placed me in handcuffs." She looked at Pruitt. "He also made several statements that will be part of the evidentiary record." Pruitt's mouth moved. No sound came out. "This precinct has been under federal investigation for 11 months. Dara continued addressing the room. "My office has assembled a federal indictment listing 7 counts against 6 individuals across this precinct's narcotics unit. Drug skimming, planted evidence, bribery, civil rights violations under color of law." She reached into her bag steadily without hesitation, the bag Pruitt had declared a threat, the bag that had been sitting 3 feet from him for the past 30 minutes, and she removed a sealed manila folder. This indictment was ready 9 days ago. Agent Webb. Webb was already moving, not toward Pruitt, toward the building itself. At his signal through the precinct's 2 secondary entrances, federal arrest teams that had been staged in the parking structure and the adjacent alleyway since 6:30 a.m. moved in with quiet, precise efficiency. 4 of them. 2 to a pair of officers across the bullpen whose names appeared on counts 4, 5, 6, and 7 of the indictment. There was no drama in it. There were calm commands, the sound of handcuffs, the sight of 4 officers in the 6th Precinct's own building being separated from their service weapons and escorted toward the federal transport vehicles that were now parked outside. The bullpen watched this happen the way people watch a controlled demolition, with the specific held-breath attention of people who understand that what is happening is irreversible. Dara looked at Pruitt. "Officer Dale Pruitt," she said. "You are listed on count 1, count 3, and count 4 of this indictment. Conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, falsification of official police records." She held his gaze. "Agent Webb, please execute the warrant." Pruitt's knees bent fractionally. He grabbed the edge of a desk. You can't." His voice had lost everything that had defined it in the captain's office. The contempt was gone. The authority was gone. The careful, practiced confidence of a man who had spent 22 years learning how to make other people feel small was gone. What remained was something raw and desperate, and, Dara thought quite specifically, the voice of a person discovering for the first time that the architecture they had built their life inside was not as solid as they had believed. "I've got 22 years. I've got a record. I followed protocol," Captain Mas Dara said without looking away from Pruitt. "Please note for the record that Officer Pruitt has had full opportunity to speak with counsel and has not done so. He is speaking voluntarily." Mast nodded mute the gold stars on his collar, looking somehow smaller than they had when he stepped out of the elevator. Webb put Pruitt in handcuffs. He did it professionally, no roughness, no theater, no flourish. He spun Pruitt around and closed the bracelets at a normal tension and recited the Miranda advisement in a level, practiced voice. Pruitt, for all the noise he had made in the captain's office, submitted to the handcuffs in silence. He looked in that moment at the 20 officers who were his colleagues, men and women. He had worked alongside, eaten lunch with, shared locker room conversations with for more than 2 decades, and found nothing. Not anger on his behalf, not confusion, not even the particular coded neutrality of people who don't want to commit. He found the faces of people who were already carefully and efficiently deciding that they did not know him as well as they had thought. The blue wall did not fall dramatically. It simply turned sideways and let him walk past alone. The Federal Command Center occupied the 3rd floor of the precinct in what had, until 45 minutes ago, been a conference room used for shift briefings and union meetings. Webb's team had been inside it since before dawn, setting up equipment and establishing encrypted uplinks with the federal building downtown. When Dara entered it for the first time, still in the hoodie, still in the running shoes, still wearing her sister's borrowed sweatshirt, it looked nothing like the room it had been. It looked like the inside of the investigation she had been living inside for 11 months. The walls were covered, timelines on wide-format paper, photographs of officers and known associates, maps of the Northeast Portland neighborhoods where the narcotics unit had concentrated its enforcement activity, cross-referenced with pins in 3 colors, documented arrests, arrest anomalies, and incident locations that had generated civilian complaints. On a whiteboard in the corner, someone had written the 6 names from the indictment in block letters and drawn lines connecting them to evidence categories. Pruitt's name was at the top of the board not because he was the most senior of the 6 by rank, but because the evidence pointed at him from more directions than anyone else. Dara stood in the doorway for a moment looking at it. 11 months of work made physical. She had seen versions of it before in the documentation, in the briefings, in the late-night review sessions in her D.C. office, and then, after she arrived in Portland, in her hotel room, with a laptop and a cold cup of room service coffee. But seeing it assembled and displayed in the physical space of the precinct being investigated gave it a weight that the documents alone had not carried. Webb came up beside her and placed a tablet on the nearest table. "You need to see this first," he said. His voice was careful in a way that told her the thing on the tablet was difficult to watch. She sat down. She picked it up. The footage was from a body camera. The timestamp in the corner read approximately 3 years earlier. The location was a dimly lit alleyway behind a bar in the northeast quadrant. She recognized the street name from the mapping sessions, a stretch of mixed commercial and residential that had appeared in 7 separate civilian complaint records during the investigation. On the screen, a young black man, Dion Ferris, 24 years old at the time, engineering student at Portland State University on a full merit scholarship, was on his knees in the alleyway. His hands were raised at shoulder height, palms out, fingers spread. He was crying, not screaming, not resisting, not doing anything that corresponded to any threat profile that any reasonable officer could have identified. He was crying with the specific, quiet desperation of someone who understands that they are in a situation they should not be in and do not know how to get out of. "Please," he was saying on the audio. "Please, I didn't do anything. I came out the back door of the bar. I was just going to my car. Please." The officer behind the camera. Dale Pruitt, his voice unmistakable, even without the visual, said in the flat conversational tone of a man performing a routine task, "You fit the description. Stop talking." Dara watched. She watched what happened next with her hands still and her face still, and her breathing carefully controlled the way she had taught herself to watch terrible things in service of understanding them fully, because understanding them fully was the only adequate response to them. The body camera powered down. Or appeared to power down. The image went momentarily dark, and then, in the darkness in the 30-second buffer recording that continued after the manual switch was engaged, a thing happened that Dale Pruitt had believed no camera would ever see. He reached into the interior chest pocket of his jacket and removed a small plastic bag. He held it for a moment, looking down at Dion Ferris, who could not see what was happening behind him. Then he crouched down, moving with practiced efficiency, with the ease of someone who had done this before, and slipped the bag into the open top of Dion's backpack, which sat on the ground beside him. Then he stood up and he kicked Dion Ferris in the side. Not with the glancing, disorienting force of someone trying to control a situation, with the full, deliberate force of someone expressing something. Dion crumpled. The sound of the impact was audible on the buffer recording, and it was the sound of a rib giving way. Then Pruitt grabbed Dion by the collar and hauled him upright. Dion's cry was short and breathless, the sound of someone trying to make a sound they don't have the air for. Dara set the tablet on the table. She did not speak for a moment. She sat with her hands flat on the surface of the table and looked at the wall. In the silence of the room, with the investigation mapped out around her, and the weight of 11 months of work, and the fresh ache in her shoulder, and the marks still red on both her wrists, she sat with the thing she had just watched and let it be what it was. "Dion Ferris," she said. "Tell me where he is." Webb had already pulled the file. He pled out 18 months into the case. Possession with intent to distribute. Public defender advised him the odds were against him, a 20-year officer's testimony against a 24-year-old with no priors in front of a jury in a county that returns blue across the board on drug cases. He paused. He served 14 months. Lost the engineering scholarship when he was convicted. Portland State has a zero-tolerance academic misconduct policy that applies to criminal convictions. He was expelled before he could appeal. Another pause. He's been working at an automotive detailing place in Gresham for the past 8 months. His parole officer reports that he complies with every condition and avoids all contact with law enforcement. Dara nodded. She was still looking at the wall. The last part, she said quietly. Avoids all contact with law enforcement. Yes. Because of what was done to him. Yes. She turned back to Webb. I want a subpoena for Dion Ferris issued this afternoon, and I want his conviction vacated before the end of business today. We don't wait for the trial. We vacate it on prosecutorial misconduct grounds as soon as the suppression motion is filed. She stood up, and the United States Attorney was back, every line of her, even in the wet hoodie, even with the marks on her wrists radiating the authority that Pruitt had looked at for 20 minutes and failed entirely to see. We are not just prosecuting Dale Pruitt for what he did to me this morning. We are prosecuting him for every life he treated like Dion Ferris's. I want every false arrest on his record in the past 7 years, identified, reviewed, and flagged for potential vacating. All of them. She picked up her bag from where she had set it on the table. And, someone please get me a coffee, she said. I've been awake since 3 a.m. and my luggage is at P. Dick's. By 9:30 in the morning, the 6th precinct of the Portland Police Bureau had become unrecognizable to itself. The 4 simultaneous arrests of the named officers, 2 narcotics detectives, a patrol sergeant who had been signing off on Pruitt's falsified reports for 4 years, and a property room administrator who had been managing the evidence discrepancies, had been executed with the quiet efficiency of people who had rehearsed the choreography and knew their marks. Each arrest had happened at a different station in the building. Each arrested officer had been separated from their weapon, advised of their rights, and walked to a federal transport vehicle without incident. The transport vehicles were gone before most of the day shift officers had finished processing what they were seeing. Connorfeld found Webb in the 3rd-floor command center at 11 minutes past 9. He was in civilian clothes. He had gone to his locker, taken off his uniform, and changed, which told Dara something specific about what he was about to do and the seriousness with which he was doing it. He was carrying a legal pad, and his hands were steady in a way that suggested he had made a decision and had made it clearly. "I want to give a statement," Feld said. "Everything I saw this morning, and 2 things before this morning that I should have reported and didn't." Webb looked at Dara. Dara nodded once. Webb sat Feld down at the conference table and opened a recording. What Feld provided over the next hour and 40 minutes was detailed, precise, and internally consistent, the marks of someone who had been carrying information for a long time and had organized it carefully in their head, even while they lacked the courage to deliver it. He described the captain's office in accurate detail. He confirmed the number of times Dara had identified herself before the handcuffs went on. He described the specific exchange in the hallway during the walk to the elevator, every word he could remember, and his memory was good. And then he described 2 prior incidents. The first, a stop and frisk of a 16-year-old in the northeast quadrant in 2021, during which Pruitt had produced a marijuana pipe from his own jacket pocket and dropped it into the teenager's hoodie pouch, then logged the arrest as a narcotics possession stop and frisk with contraband discovered on the subject. Feld had been standing 8 feet away. He had not said anything because Pruitt had told him afterward in the locker room that this was how things worked when the courts couldn't keep up with the volume of actual criminals on the street, and that if Feld had a problem with the way real police work operated, there was a filing job at the city clerk's office that might suit him better. The second, a citizen complaint form, a formal civilian complaint filed against Pruitt by a 40-year-old woman named Denise Mercer, who had been roughed up during a welfare check in 2022. Feld had watched Pruitt retrieve the form from the complaint folder on the front desk, tear it in half, and drop it in the recycling bin. The complaint was logged in the database as resolved, withdrew complaint. Denise Mercer had not withdrawn anything. Feld finished his statement. He put the legal pad on the table and looked at his hands. "Why now?" Webb asked. It was not an accusatory question. It was a genuine one. Feld was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because she walked out of those handcuffs and she still had more authority in the building than he ever did. And I realized that the thing I was afraid of—" He paused, finding the words, "the thing I thought I was protecting myself from by not speaking. It wasn't real. He made it feel real, but it wasn't." Captain Gerald Mast was placed under administrative suspension pending a federal negligence review before noon. He was not arrested. There was no evidence that he had participated directly in Pruitt's crimes. But there was very clear evidence that 17 internal complaint documents and 2 anomalous evidence room audit reports had crossed his desk during his tenure, and that he had taken no action on any of them, and that his reason for taking no action appeared to be a preference for institutional peace over institutional accountability. He was escorted from the building that bore his name on its captain's roster, where his photograph hung in the commendation gallery, where he had worked for 11 years by a federal agent who held the door open for him without comment. Mast did not look back at the building. He did not look at the officers watching from the windows. He got into his car in the parking garage and sat in it for a long time before he started the engine. By mid-morning, the 6th Precinct's daily log, its entire body camera archive going back 7 years, its evidence room inventory, and its digital communications servers were under federal seal. Webb's team had installed its own administrators on the evidence room system before 8 a.m. Nothing was going anywhere. Dara drove herself to Gresham at 2 in the afternoon. She had borrowed Webb's car, a plain gray sedan with federal plates that she parked around the corner from the automotive detailing shop, and she had not called ahead, and she had not sent a paralegal, and she was still wearing the hoodie. She had considered changing into the emergency spare suit she kept rolled in her laptop bag for delayed luggage situations like this one, and she had decided against it because she thought the hoodie might matter for this particular conversation in a way that a suit would not. The detailing shop was a clean, bright-lit operation on a commercial stretch between a tire center and a sandwich shop. There was a radio playing somewhere inside, and the smell of cleaning solution and car wax hanging in the mild afternoon air. A man was on a lunch break on a plastic chair outside the back entrance, young, wearing work clothes, eating from a paper bag with the particular focused economy of someone who has exactly 30 minutes and intends to use them. She recognized him from the case photograph. Dion Ferris, 27 now, thinner than he had been in the arrest photo, with the specific leanness that sometimes came from the kind of months he had experienced. He had a slight asymmetry to the way he was sitting, his left side, lower than his right, braced against a chair back in the particular way of someone managing a chronic discomfort in their ribs or their left flank. He looked up when he heard her footsteps. His eyes, quick alert, the eyes of someone who had learned to assess situations, rapidly moved over her and landed on her face. He did not recognize her. Why would he? She was a woman in a hoodie approaching him in a parking lot. His posture shifted, subtly but unmistakably, a drawing in a readiness, the entirely reasonable wariness of a young black man in the Pacific Northwest who had learned what unanticipated approaches from unfamiliar people could cost him. "I'm not a threat," Dara said. She said it simply, standing 6 feet away, not moving closer. "My name is Dara Osei. I'm the United States Attorney for this region. I want to talk to you for a few minutes if you're willing." "Not here. I don't want your employer to feel uncomfortable. Wherever you want." He looked at her for a long time. His paper bag sat open on his lap. On the radio inside, a song she didn't recognize was playing through the walls. "The United States Attorney," he said. His voice was careful, flat without being hostile. "Is that supposed to mean something to me specifically?" "Yes," she said. "It means I'm the one who arrested Dale Pruitt this morning." The silence that followed was very complete. Dion set his paper bag on the ground beside the chair. He looked at his hands for a moment, then he looked back at her, and something in his face had shifted. It was not relief, not yet, because he had learned not to spend relief before it was warranted. It was more like the expression of someone who has heard a sound they have been listening for a very long time and is still not certain whether it was real. "What do you want to talk to me about?" he said. "The alley behind the bar on Northeast Killingsworth," she said. 3 years ago, in October." He was very still. "I want you to know," she said, "that we have the body camera footage. All of it, including the buffer." She watched his face, and she saw the moment he understood what she meant by buffer. She saw what that understanding did to him, the specific shock of someone discovering that the thing they were told was invisible had been seen all along. "I watched it this afternoon, and I want you to know what I'm going to do about it." She sat down on the concrete curb beside his chair, because it seemed important that this conversation happen at eye level rather than with her standing over him. "Your conviction is being vacated today," she said. "Prosecutorial misconduct grounds the evidence used to secure your guilty plea was planted, and the officer who planted it is in federal custody as of this morning. By the end of business, your record is clear." She paused. "And I need you when you're ready to tell a federal jury what happened in that alley." He was quiet for a very long time. The radio kept playing through the walls. A truck went by on the street. "Every lawyer I talked to," he finally said, and his voice was different now, not guarded, not careful. Something raw and more honest beneath it told me to take the deal. "Take the deal. You'll be out in 14 months. At least you'll have a future." "Nobody." He stopped. "Nobody said they believed me. The public defender, my parents, my girlfriend at the time. Everybody said take the deal because nobody was going to believe me over a 20-year cop." He looked at her. "Why do you believe me?" "Because I watched the footage," Dara said. "And because the footage confirmed what the pattern of his arrests already indicated. And because she paused, finding the precise words, because the fact that no one believed you is exactly the reason he was able to do it again and again. And I am not interested in a world where that continues. He nodded. He did not say anything for a moment. Then, quietly, Kay. Raymond Colt arrived at the Federal Detention Center in downtown Portland at 3:15 in the afternoon, and his suit cost more than most people's monthly rent, and his confidence occupied a room the way expensive cologne does, preceding him and lingering after. He had been handling police union defense work for 19 years, and he had developed over those 19 years the particular professional serenity of a man who has faced a lot of very bad situations and found that most of them resolve into something manageable, given the right application of legal pressure and the right relationships in the right places. He sat across from Pruitt in the attorney consultation room and listened to Pruitt's account of the morning without expression. When Pruitt finished, Colt was quiet for a moment. The woman in the hoodie, Colt said carefully, is the United States Attorney. I know that now, Pruitt said. He was not chastened exactly. He was angry, a specific defensive anger that had found its target not in his own choices, but in the situation. He had been wronged. That was the story his brain was offering him, and he was accepting it. I didn't know it then. She didn't look like Dale. Colt's voice was not unkind, but it was very precise. Listen to me carefully. What she looked like is going to be the foundation of the prosecution's case. She walked in, she identified herself multiple times, and you declined to verify her credentials because of how she looked. That is the case. That is the entire case. He leaned forward slightly. The question is what we build around it. The union representative held a press conference outside the 6th Precinct at 5 in the evening. He was a barrel-chested man with a thick gray mustache who had the instinctive media fluency of someone who had been defending police officers in front of cameras for a long time. He stood at the precinct steps with 3 other union officials flanking him and delivered a statement that was careful and coded and effective in the specific demographic where it was designed to land. Officer Pruitt, he said, had responded to an unauthorized person in a restricted government facility. He had followed the protocols he had been trained to follow. The U.S. Attorney's Office had staged a deliberate confrontation by sending a federal official into a precinct without identification in plain clothes at an hour before the scheduled meeting. This was entrapment. This was a politically motivated action by an activist prosecutor who had a well-documented bias against law enforcement. Officer Pruitt had given 22 years of service to the city of Portland. He was a husband and a father. He was being persecuted. By 6:30 the next morning, 3 conservative talk radio programs had played clips of the press conference and were running with the entrapment narrative. None of the radio hosts had read the federal indictment. None of them knew about the Dayon Ferris body cam footage. None of them knew about the ledger. They knew that a federal prosecutor had walked into a police precinct in a hoodie and that a veteran officer had been arrested as a result, and that narrative shorn of every fact that gave it its shape was functional enough for their purposes. Dara watched 90 seconds of the press conference on her laptop in her temporary office at the federal building and then closed it. She returned to the case file. She had learned a long time ago that the answer to noise was not more noise. The answer to noise was evidence. The bail hearing was held before a magistrate judge who had appeared in the Portland Police Bureau's internal fundraising records 17 times over the past 5 years. This was a fact Dara's office had documented. It was also a fact that disqualification required more than a pattern of donation, and that Colt had filed the bail petition with timing and venue selection that suggested familiarity with the magistrate's schedule. Pruitt was released on a bond of $80,000 secured against the equity in the house on Maple Ridge Drive that he shared with his wife Sandra and their son Kyle. He was released on a Friday. He was ordered not to contact any of the named witnesses in the federal indictment. On the following Monday, Connor Feld's landlord, a retired Portland patrol officer named Gerard Haas, who had served under Pruitt's supervision for 8 years in the mid-2000s, called Feld's phone and told him that his lease would not be renewed at the end of the month. No reason given. Just the landlord had decided to take the unit in a different direction. Feld called Webb at 9:12 a.m. By 2 p.m., Dara's office had filed a contempt motion with the federal court, attaching the phone records showing a call from Pruitt's personal cell phone to Haas's cell phone at 7:43 that same Monday morning, 41 minutes before Haas called Feld. The contempt motion also attached a declaration from Feld describing the conversation with his landlord and the timeline of preceding events. The federal judge who heard the contempt motion, Judge Patricia Holden, who had been assigned the full case and who had read the indictment with the kind of close attention that a complex federal case required, denuded bail and remanded Pruitt to federal custody at 4:45 p.m. She added the witness tampering charge to the indictment in a 2-page ruling that described Pruitt's behavior as precisely the pattern of conduct the conditions of release were designed to prevent. Before his bail was revoked, Pruitt had one visit. Kyle Pruitt came to the house on Maple Ridge Drive on the Wednesday between the Friday release and the Monday contempt. He arrived in the afternoon and found his father in the kitchen sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and a legal pad covered in notes. Kyle was 24. He worked in software. He had his father's jawline and none of his father's certainty. They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours, and the conversation was not comfortable, and it was not resolved. Pruitt spoke about the case in the language of a man who was still at the center of himself, certain that the story had been constructed around him rather than growing from him. He asked Kyle to make a public statement of support. He asked Sandra to appear with him at a community press event the union was planning. Kyle said he needed to think about it. Sandra, who had been listening from the doorway for the last part of the conversation, did not say anything at all. She looked at her husband for a long moment with an expression that had no anger in it and no grief in it, an expression that had moved past both of those into something quieter and more final. Then she went upstairs. 2 weeks later, Pruitt was back in federal custody. The contempt charge had been added to the indictment. Colt privately advised cooperation. Pruitt refused. He believed his record would speak for him. He believed the union would find a way. He believed that 22 years meant something that 7 months of federal investigation could not simply erase. He was wrong about all of it, but he would not fully understand that until he was sitting in a courtroom. The supplemental evidence disclosure was filed on a Wednesday morning 3 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin, and it arrived in Raymond Colt's inbox at 7:04 a.m. with the subject line, United States versus Pruitt Supplemental Disclosure. Re-audio evidence Osei device 001. Colt read it standing at his kitchen counter in his bathrobe holding a cup of coffee that went cold in his hand while he read. The disclosure was precise and complete and left no room for ambiguity. Dara Osei had entered the 6th Precinct on the morning of the incident carrying a federally sanctioned concealed recording device operating under the authority of a Title III warrant issued 48 hours prior by a federal magistrate judge in the District of Oregon. The warrant had been issued as part of the ongoing investigation into the 6th Precinct's narcotics unit. Its operational parameters were properly scoped and properly documented. The device had been running continuously from the moment she stepped out of the rideshare on the sidewalk outside the precinct to the moment Marcus Webb removed the handcuffs from her wrists. Colt put his coffee cup down. He picked up his phone and called Pruitt at the Federal Detention Center. He did not begin with pleasantries. "Did you say you people are all the same?" to her, he asked. "In the captain's office, when you had her cuffed and were walking her to the elevator." The pause on the other end of the line lasted long enough to be its own answer. "I may have said something, Dale." Colt's voice was very controlled. "I need you to hear me." The recording captured everything. From the moment she identified herself the first time to the moment Webb took the handcuffs off. Every word you said, Every word she said. It is all there. And the recording shows he stopped for a moment, organizing what he was about to say with precision that she said nothing that could be construed as deceptive. She identified herself clearly and repeatedly. She made no provocative statements. She did not escalate. You escalated. You made the decision to detain her based on what she looked like, and the recording proves it beyond any doubt that any jury anywhere would have. Pruitt said nothing. The entrapment defense is gone, Colt said. She was not acting in a deceptive capacity. She was a federal official conducting a lawful investigation, and you detained her without legal basis and used physical force in doing so. The recording is the case. We have nothing to build against it. The wire reveal reached Judge Patricia Holden's desk the same morning. She read the disclosure and the warrant documentation and the technical specifications for the recording device, and she read Colt's motion to suppress filed the same afternoon, in which he argued that the recording violated Pruitt's reasonable expectation of privacy in the captain's office. Holden denied the motion in 2 pages. Her reasoning was straightforward. Dara had been lawfully present in the building and in the office. She had not obtained access by deception. She had not misrepresented herself. She had in fact repeatedly and accurately represented herself to no effect. The recording captured Pruitt's own words spoken voluntarily in a space to which he had no greater reasonable privacy interest than any officer on duty in a government building. The motion was denied. The day after the denial, the Oregon Police Officers Association quietly withdrew its legal funding from Pruitt's defense. The statement released was brief and institutional. The union's bylaws precluded funding a defense in cases where the conduct alleged fell outside the scope of authorized law enforcement duties. Colt was now being paid from Pruitt's savings account. The savings account Colt privately estimated would cover his fees through the beginning of the trial and not much further. Sandra Pruitt had consulted a divorce attorney the week before. She had not filed yet, but she had consulted. The federal courthouse in Portland occupied a downtown block of glass and pale stone that reflected the gray sky on most mornings and the rare Portland sunshine on the others, and on the first day of United States versus Dale Pruitt, it was reflecting the gray, the particular flat pewter of a northwest winter sky that offered light without warmth and made everything look slightly more serious than it might otherwise have been. The courtroom was packed every day. This was not the ordinary attendance of a federal trial. Federal trials were generally sparsely attended affairs, their procedural complexity discouraging casual interest. This one was different. The story of Dara Osei's arrest, the United States attorney handcuffed in the precinct she was investigating, walked through the bullpen in a navy hoodie, had become one of those news events that functions as a kind of collective Rorschach test. People projected onto it what they needed to project onto it and argued fiercely from those projections. The courtroom gallery was full of people who needed to be in the room where the official accounting happened. Dara sat in the second row of the gallery on the right side with Marcus Webb beside her. She wore each day a different version of the same charcoal-adjacent suit. She did not lead from the front. Her deputy, a precise and effective attorney named Jordan Fitch, occupied the prosecution table and ran the day-to-day examination of witnesses. Dara was present as a witness herself. She was on the prosecution's witness list to testify to the morning's events, and she was also present because she wanted Pruitt to see her. She wanted to be the constant, steady, uncrossable thing in his peripheral vision for every day of the trial. Not as an act of intimidation, as a fact. She had come to this precinct in a hoodie, and he had put her in handcuffs, and she was here now, and the handcuffs were going the other direction, and she was going to be here every day until the last gavel. Pruitt sat at the defense table in the gray suit that had not fit him well at the beginning of the trial and fit him less well as the days progressed because he was losing weight, not voluntarily, but in the way bodies lose weight when they are under sustained extreme psychological stress, and the appetite that once seemed automatic simply stops arriving. He looked smaller. This was not metaphorical. The man who had filled the doorway of Captain Mast's office, who had used his physical presence as a first instrument of authority, now occupied his chair at the defense table like something that had been partially deflated. Colt sat beside him and wore his suits well and maintained his professional demeanor. But even Colt Dara thought had about him the quality of a man who understood the shape of the case he was in and was managing the terms of the ending rather than contesting whether there would be one. In the gallery's front row on the left side of the aisle, 3 women sat together. Their names were in the federal case files under the section documenting Pruitt's documented pattern of conduct. Beyond the named counts, 3 women who had been detained, searched, arrested on charges that later evaporated, subjected to the same algorithmic contempt that had colored his assessment of Dara on the morning of the incident. They had not been officially called as witnesses in the trial's current phase. They had simply come. They sat with their hands in their laps, and they looked at the back of Pruitt's head, and their presence carried a weight in the room that no courtroom declaration could have replicated. In the 4th row, Dayon Ferris sat in a pressed button-down shirt. He was here for the body cam presentation today. He held a small notebook in his lap and was writing in it not notes about the proceedings, Dara thought, but something else. She did not know what. She would ask him later, and he would tell her he was writing down the questions he planned to ask his engineering professors when he went back to school. Webb testified first. He was a precise and effective witness, the qualities that made him an excellent investigator, translated cleanly to the stand, where clarity and economy and the absence of embellishment are the primary virtues. He walked the jury through the 11-month investigation from its inception at the federal level, through the morning of the arrest, establishing the timeline with a specificity that left no gaps. The jury learned that the indictment against Pruitt had been completed 9 days before Dara set foot in the 6th precinct. That the decision to conduct a dawn arrival and observe the precinct's unguarded morning operation was documented in the investigation log dated 2 days before the visit. That the concealed recording device was authorized by a court-issued warrant that predated the visit by 48 hours. That none of this, not a single element of Dara's presence in that building, was constructed after the fact. She had come to observe a precinct under investigation, and the precinct had obliged her. Colt cross-examined Webb efficiently, probing the warrant's scope and the chain of custody for the recording, finding nothing to work with and spending 20 minutes on nothing. The jury watched Colt not find anything and understood what that meant. Connor Feld testified second. He had not worn his uniform. He no longer had one, having resigned from the Portland Police Bureau 3 days after the arrest, and he sat in the witness chair in a plain gray sweater and answered every question with the detailed accuracy of someone who had been rehearsing his conscience for months. He confirmed Dara's identification of herself. He confirmed the badge verification that Pruitt refused to perform. He described the conversation in the captain's office with the kind of precise recall that jurors instinctively trust. And then, when Fitch asked him about prior incidents he had witnessed, Feld described 2 things that had nothing to do with Dara. He described the teenager and the marijuana pipe. He described Denise Mercer's complaint form and the recycling bin. And he described, for the jury's benefit, the conversation Pruitt had held with him in the locker room after the teenager. The conversation in which Pruitt had explained that this was how things worked, that the courts couldn't keep up with the volume that real police work required, a certain flexibility that the official record didn't always have room for. "Did you believe him?" Fitch asked. Feld was quiet for a moment. "I didn't not believe him," he said. "That's different. I was new. He had 22 years. He spoke like someone who had figured things out. It took me too long to understand that what he had actually figured out was how to avoid accountability." Colt's cross was brief. The body cam footage played on the afternoon of the 2nd day of testimony. Fitch had chosen to present it without much preamble. He introduced the exhibit, established the chain of custody, confirmed the technical specifications of the buffer recording, and then played it. He did not describe what the jury was about to see. He let them see it. The courtroom went completely quiet during the 30-second buffer sequence. The 30 seconds in which Pruitt, believing no camera was recording, removed the bag from his own jacket and placed it in Dion Ferris's backpack. 30 seconds that had been captured by an automatic function Pruitt had not known existed, or had not known enough to account for in a body camera that was 3 years old at the time of the incident and running the firmware version that the manufacturer had shipped in 2021. 30 seconds that had lived in the Portland Police Bureau's server archive, cataloged under Pruitt's badge number for 3 years. 2 jurors flinched. A third covered her mouth with her hand. Pruitt stared at the defense table. He did not look at the screen. Dion Ferris took the stand on the 3rd day. He walked to the witness chair with a slight asymmetry in his gait that was the only visible residue of the night in the alley, the rib that had healed crooked that had been surgically corrected the previous year that still occasionally ached in cold weather. He sat down and adjusted the microphone and looked at the jury with the direct, steady gaze of someone who had decided that he was not going to be diminished by this room. He told the jury about the night in the alley, about coming out the back door of the bar at 11:40 p.m., heading to his car, hearing his name called by an officer who had stopped him twice before in the neighborhood, about being put on his knees, about asking what he had done and being told to stop talking, about not knowing until years later how the narcotics had gotten into his bag because he had watched the arrest happen and watched the arrest report get filed and watched the charges get read out in a courtroom and still could not explain to himself how the drugs had appeared in a bag that had been on his back. "You pled guilty," Fitch said, "to a charge you believed you were innocent of. My public defender said the odds were 90-10 against me at trial. A 20-year officer against a 24-year-old black kid with no money and no witnesses." He looked at the jury. She said she believed me. She said she didn't doubt me. She said the jury probably wouldn't. A pause. "So I pled." "What did you lose?" Dion looked at his hands briefly and then back at the jury. "My scholarship, my degree. The first 3 years of my career. I'm an engineer. I had a full merit scholarship. I was in my junior year. I lost all of that. I lost my apartment because I couldn't pay for it without the scholarship. I lost a relationship. I lost..." He stopped. "I lost the ability to walk into a public space without calculating the risk. That's what I lost that I still think about. The calculation. Every time. Every public space. What's the risk here? Am I safe here? Can I ask for help here, or will asking for help make it worse?" He paused again. "I shouldn't have to live like that. I didn't do anything." The courtroom was very still. The concealed recording from the morning of Dara's arrest played on the 4th day of testimony. Fitch asked for 2 speakers to be set up on either side of the jury box, and he played it at full clarity, and the courtroom heard Pruitt's voice. The voice that had spent 22 years filling rooms with authority filled the courtroom now in a very different context. They heard Dara identify herself 4 times, clearly, professionally, without embellishment or aggression. They heard the mockery. They heard the dismissal of the credentials. They heard the radio call going in. They heard in the last minute of the recording before the elevator opened, Pruitt's voice very close to the microphone, close enough that the recording quality was highest, saying, "You people are all the same. Always got an angle. In here, you're nothing." The phrase landed in the courtroom and remained there the way certain statements do not, dissolving into the ambient noise of the proceedings, but sitting in the air with a specific lasting weight. Colt did not cross-examine on the recording. He had nothing to ask about it that would help his client. Pruitt took the stand on the 6th day of the 7-day trial. Colt had argued against it. He had made the argument that experienced defense attorneys make when their client insists on testifying that the risk outweighs the benefit that the jury has already formed, impressions that testimony could only sharpen that the safest thing is to let the defense rest on the holes in the prosecution's case rather than on the defendant's credibility. He had made this argument twice. Pruitt had refused both times. He needed to explain himself. He needed the jury to hear his version of events from his voice in his words. It was the decision of a man who had spent 22 years as the authority in every room he occupied and could not conceive of a room in which silence was the more powerful choice. He was not a bad witness in the technical sense. He was experienced at testifying. He knew courtroom procedure. He presented himself with a surface composure that Colt had worked hard to construct over the preceding weeks. He described his actions on the morning of the incident in the careful, procedurally couched language of a trained officer. He used phrases like "in my professional assessment" and "based on the totality of the circumstances visible to me." He was in the technical sense coherent. Dara let Fitch handle the first pass of cross-examination. Fitch was thorough and precise and established several significant inconsistencies between Pruitt's testimony and the evidentiary record. Then, before the redirect, Fitch conferred with Dara at the prosecution table. She stood up. She carried a single legal pad, and she walked to the podium in the well of the courtroom with the unhurried confidence of someone who has been doing this for 15 years in courtrooms where the stakes were always very high, and who has learned that the most important thing you can communicate before you say a word is that you are entirely at ease. She set the legal pad on the podium surface. She did not look at it. "Mr. Pruitt," she said. His eyes found hers across the well of the courtroom, and she watched him feel it, the specific, particular sensation of facing across the courtroom the person you handcuffed in a government office while she told you calmly and clearly that you were making a mistake. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Do you remember the morning of our meeting in Captain Mast's office?" "I remember responding to an unauthorized person." "Yes or no, please." "Do you remember the morning?" "Yes." She walked him through it, chronologically, factually. "Yes or no, please," whenever he attempted to add context she hadn't invited. "Did she say good morning?" "Yes." "Did you return the greeting?" "No." "Did she state she had an appointment?" "Yes." "Did you ask to see the appointment documentation?" "No." "Did she offer to produce her credentials?" "Yes." "Did you allow her to do so?" "No." "Did you call in a trespassing charge on the radio before you had verified her identity in any form?" "Yes." Each answer tightened the case like a knot being drawn. The jury watched the chronology build its own architecture question by question and understood what the architecture meant. "Mr. Pruitt," Dara said, and her voice dropped very slightly, not to a whisper, but to the register of someone saying something. "They want to carry the indictment against you. Includes charges related to your participation in a narcotics distribution protection arrangement with 2 drug distributors operating in the Northeast Corridor over a period of 4 years. You received payments." She lifted a document from the legal pad. "This ledger was recovered from a safe deposit box registered to your wife's maiden name. It details 47 payments across 4 years. The handwriting on the ledger is yours, confirmed by 3 independent forensic document analysts." She set the ledger on the defense table, open to the relevant page. "I am going to ask you directly, did you receive those payments?" Pruitt's attorney began to rise. Pruitt spoke first. The words came out before Colt's objection reached its full height. "I didn't know what they were doing," he said. "The guys I was dealing with, I took the envelopes, but I didn't know the full extent of their—" The courtroom erupted. Not loudly, it was a federal court, and the instinct toward decorum is strong in federal courts, but the murmur that went through the gallery was the sound of 60 people simultaneously processing the same thing the defendant had just admitted on the stand under oath, that he had accepted payments from the people he was accused of protecting. He had qualified the admission. He had tried to constrain its implications, but the admission was there in the record, in the air, in the court reporter's transcript. Colt put his head in his hands. Dara closed the legal pad. She looked at Pruitt and he looked at her, and she held his gaze for a long moment, Not with triumph, not with any satisfaction she was willing to let land on her face in a courtroom, but with the clear, direct attention of someone who has seen something they needed to see and is ready to move forward. Nothing further. "Your Honor," she said. She turned her back and walked to the prosecution table and sat down. She did not look at Pruitt again. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 40 minutes. This was, given the volume and complexity of the evidence, a remarkably short deliberation. It suggested that the jury had not experienced significant disagreement on the fundamental questions, that the discussion had been more organizational than substantive, confirming what each juror had already individually concluded rather than negotiating between different positions. When the foreperson stood to read the verdict, Pruitt gripped the edge of the defense table with both hands. His knuckles were white. Colt sat beside him with the composed resignation of a professional who has given his best effort to a case and knows precisely where that effort stands in relation to the outcome. In the gallery, Sandra Pruitt sat 3 rows back. She had attended every day of the trial which Dara had noted and considered. She was sitting now with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance somewhere between the defense table and the judge's bench. Not on her husband, not away from him, in a pointed way, just in the particular place that people find when they have processed something very large and are waiting for the formal conclusion of a story they already know the ending of. Kyle had not come to the verdict day. On count 1 conspiracy to distribute controlled substances under Title 21, we, the jury, find the defendant Dale Pruitt guilty. Pruitt's grip on the table tightened. On count 2, deprivation of civil rights under color of law under Title 18, guilty. On count 3, bribery of a law enforcement officer, guilty. On count 4, falsification of official government records, guilty. On count 5, planting of evidence specifically as documented in the incident involving Dion Ferris on October 14, 2021, guilty. On count 6, witness tampering, specifically the communication to Gerard Haas resulting in pressure on Connor Feld, guilty. On count 7, obstruction of justice, guilty. On the 7th guilty, Pruitt's posture simply ended. He did not collapse, he was held upright by some residual physical discipline, but he deflated. His shoulders dropped, his grip on the table released. He looked down at the surface in front of him, and then, very slowly, he looked up at the gallery, searching for something. For support, for alliance, for a face that was with him. He found his wife's profile turned slightly away. He found the faces of the 3 women in the front row watching him with the calm, complete attention of people who have waited a long time for this moment. He found, if he looked carefully, and he did, Dara Osei sitting in the 2nd row with her hands folded in her lap, watching the proceedings with the quiet focus she brought to everything. She did not smile. She did not nod. She simply looked at him with the clear, factual attention of a person observing the conclusion of a documented sequence of events. Judge Patricia Holden proceeded to sentencing without a recess, having reviewed the pre-sentencing report and victim impact statements in advance. She was a woman in her early 60s with silver-streaked natural hair and reading glasses that she wore at the end of a chain, and she had spent 30 years in federal law before taking the bench, and she had the manner of someone who had seen a great many things and had learned to say what she needed to say without theatrical embellishment. She looked at Dale Pruitt, who was now standing barely with the particular shakiness of someone whose legs are making a decision their brain has not yet ratified, and she spoke clearly and without rushing. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, "you have requested leniency on the basis of your 22 years of service. The court has reviewed that record carefully. What the court finds is a record that contains, interspersed among routine performance marks, 17 internal affairs complaints across 12 years, 2 anomalous evidence audit flags, and a pattern of enforcement activity that reveals not a dedicated public servant who occasionally made poor decisions, but a man who used the architecture of public service to insulate a criminal enterprise. Your service was not tarnished by your crimes. Your service was the vehicle through which your crimes were committed." She picked up the sentencing document. For the 7 counts on which you have been found guilty, the court sentences you to 27 years in federal prison. You are not eligible for parole consideration until you have served 85% of that sentence. Under the federal civil asset forfeiture statute, the court orders the immediate seizure of your municipal pension in its entirety. Those funds will be applied first to restitution for Deon Ferris and then to restitution for 4 other documented victims whose civil claims have been filed alongside this prosecution. The court also orders forfeiture of any financial assets connected to the bribery payments documented in the ledger. She set the document down. Marshals take the defendant into custody. The 2 U.S. Marshals who moved from the back of the courtroom were not officers Pruitt knew. They were not people who had eaten lunch with him or shared a locker room with him or owed him any particular consideration. They approached the defense table with efficient professional calm, and one of them said, "Sir, please stand and turn around," in the flat, instructional voice of someone completing a task. Pruitt turned around. The handcuffs closed around his wrists. The sound of the ratchet, the small, precise mechanical click of the steel engaging, was exactly the same sound that his handcuffs had made in Captain Mast's office when he had closed them on Dara Osei's wrists 7 months earlier. This observation passed through the courtroom in silence present for anyone who was thinking about it, which was most people, and it required no comment. Pruitt was led toward the side door. He looked back once. Dara was looking at him. She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she turned to the notepad on her lap and wrote something down because she had an appointment in an hour, and there were things she needed to remember, and he was, as of this moment, a closed file. The Federal Correctional Institution at Sheridan, Oregon, sits in the Willamette Valley between Portland and the Coast Range, occupying a stretch of federal property that is flat and functional and entirely without drama. It is the kind of place that was designed with maximum utility and minimum sentiment, and it communicates this immediately and without apology to anyone who arrives there. Dale Pruitt arrived by federal transport van on a Tuesday morning in November, 11 days after sentencing. He had lost 19 pounds since his arrest. He had not lost them intentionally, they had simply left the appetite that had once been automatic, declining to show up reliably as the months of the case wore on. He wore for the processing intake a standard-issue institutional outfit that smelled of industrial washing and other people's history, and he stood in the intake line of the processing center and waited his turn with the particular stillness of someone who has not yet fully integrated the reality of where they are. The intake guard was young, 25, maybe 26. He had a quiet professional manner and the careful impassivity of someone who processes a great many people every day and has learned not to make it personal in either direction. Pruitt, standing at the counter, attempted a familiar move. The move that had worked in 100 different versions of this kind of interaction over 22 years. He leaned slightly toward the guard station. He referenced the precinct. He used the phrase "on the job." He suggested with the practiced ease of a man who had spent decades using his professional identity as social currency that there was a brotherhood of uniform and a mutual understanding between people who wore one. The guard looked at him with the absolute blankness of someone to whom this statement has no more purchase than a vending machine transaction. "Inmate number 31847, he said. "Move to Station 3 for photographs." That was the first thing. The second was the cell assignment. His attorney had requested protective custody, a separate housing unit for inmates whose backgrounds put them at particular risk in general population. The request had been filed with the institution's administrative office the day before transport. The administrative office had processed it, assigned it a case number, and placed it in a review queue. The review queue required 14 to 21 business days. In the interim, housing assignments defaulted to general population based on risk level assessment. Pruitt's risk level assessment placed him in general population building C Unit 7. He was escorted there by a corrections officer who walked with the same efficient indifference as the intake guard who answered Pruitt's questions about the protective custody status with a non-committal that's in process that told him nothing useful, and who deposited him at the entrance to Unit 7 and returned down the corridor. Building C Unit 7 was a two-tier residential housing unit with 42 cells and a common area. It was loud in the way that institutional spaces are loud, not one source of noise, but the accumulated sound of 42 separate lives continuing in a very small space. The television on the common area wall competing with conversations and the clang of metal surfaces and the periodic mechanical sounds of a building maintaining itself. The smell was the smell of people and cleaning products and a particular quality of recycled air. Pruitt walked into Unit 7 and was noticed immediately. This was not vanity. This was simple fact. New arrivals are always noticed in closed communities, and arrivals who carry a particular institutional signature, in Pruitt's case, the specific gait and posture of someone who has spent 22 years as a law enforcement officer, the physical vocabulary of someone accustomed to projecting authority, are noticed more quickly and in a specific way. And in the particular community of a federal penitentiary, the news that traveled ahead of him, a dirty cop narcotics planted evidence the body cam, was news that carried a precise and settled meaning. His cellmate was a man named Bowden, 38, quiet in his movements, with a stillness that was not peaceful, but controlled the stillness of a man who has spent years in circumstances where losing composure had immediate and serious consequences, and who has, as a result, developed perfect composure as a survival tool. He was sitting on the lower bunk reading when Pruitt arrived. He looked up. He looked at Pruitt for a moment with the evaluating calm of someone completing an assessment, and then he looked back at his book. "I know who you are," Bowden said to the page without hostility. "You're the cop who planted on the kid to hit a quota." Pruitt stood at the cell door. "That's what they're saying out there," Bowden continued. "And the trafficking thing." He turned a page. "We have a code in here. Not complicated. You don't hurt women. You don't hurt kids. You don't plant. And you don't sell people." He looked up. "You did all four." Pruitt said nothing. "I'm not going to do anything to you," Bowden said. "I'm a short timer. I don't need the complications, but I'm telling you so you understand what you're walking into, because understanding it might keep you safer than not understanding it." He returned to his book. "Get your stuff organized. Count is in an hour." The first week was a tutorial in the specific geography of powerlessness. Every social tool Pruitt had relied on for 22 years, the badge, the uniform, the institutional authority, the physical size that had once communicated consequence. None of it functioned in this space. He was physically intact and comprehensively without power, which was a new experience, and it pressed on him in ways he had not anticipated and could not explain. He had understood intellectually that prison would be difficult. He had not understood that the difficulty would be primarily internal, the sustained grinding experience of being nobody in a place where nobody had any reason to make him somebody. He filed grievances, 2 in the first week, 3 in the second. They were processed and reviewed and responded to within the institutional timeline, which meant 3 to 4 weeks. They produced no meaningful changes. He wrote letters to his attorney. Colt responded to each one professionally and with diminishing specificity because the avenues available to him were narrowing as the appeals timeline developed and the evidence record calcified into the uncontestable thing it was. He tried to sleep at night and found that the thing that occupied the space behind his eyes in the dark, the thing that would not leave him alone and would not let him rest, was not the trial or the sentence or the sounds of the building at night. It was the captain's office, the beige wall, the navy hoodie pulled up over her hair, the sound of the recording capturing every word he said while he laughed at a credential that was more real than anything in his wallet. The drop of the handcuff key on the linoleum floor, the click of the elevator, The expression on Mast's face, he replayed it many times. He replayed it looking for the moment where the choice had been different. He did not find it because the choice had not been made consciously. It had been made automatically in the 2 seconds it took his eyes to complete a scan and reach a conclusion, and the conclusion had been reached with the certainty of someone who had been reaching it for 22 years without consequence. The consequence had finally arrived. It was 27 years in federal prison minus administrative consideration for good behavior, and it was sitting in the cell beside him every night, and it did not leave. 6 months into Pruitt's sentence on a Thursday in late spring, his son came to Sheridan. Kyle had not come before. He had not called. He had not written. In the early months, there had been periodic communications from Sandra through their respective attorneys, practical matters related to the house, the asset forfeiture, the financial reorganization of a life that had been structured around a pension that no longer existed, but Kyle had been entirely absent from all of it. Pruitt had been told through the divorce proceedings that Kyle had moved to Seattle. He had not been told anything else. The visitation room at Sheridan was a standard configuration federal facility, 2 rows of booths divided by thick glass panels, telephone handsets on each side, a guard station at the far end. It smelled of cleaning solution and plastic chairs and the particular compressed tension of people who have important things to say to one another and a limited time to say them through a piece of glass. Pruitt was brought in by a corrections officer and sat in the booth. He picked up the handset. On the other side of the glass, Kyle sat down. He was 24 now and looked to his father's eyes older than that, not aged badly, but settled with a quality of having resolved something that had been open before. He was wearing a plain jacket and an expression that was neither warm nor hostile. It was the expression of someone who has made a decision and is present to communicate it. Kyle picked up his handset. He did not say hello. "Mom's divorce was finalized last month," he said. "She's keeping the name for the paperwork, but she's not using it socially anymore. She went back to her family name." A pause. "She's doing okay. She's staying with her sister in Bend for now. She got a job at an insurance office." Pruitt listened. He nodded. He was holding the handset with both hands the way people hold things when they are trying to convey that they are gripping on. "She didn't ask me to come here," Kyle continued. "This is me." He looked at his father through the glass with an expression that Pruitt in his most honest moments recognized as the expression of someone who is choosing truth over ease. "I needed to tell you something in person." "Okay," Pruitt said. "I changed my name." Kyle said it with a flatness that made it more final than if he had said it with anger. Anger would have meant there was still heat. This was something that had cooled completely and set. Legally. 4 months ago. "I'm Kyle Manders now, Mom's maiden name." Pruitt was silent for a long moment. "I had friends show me the body cam footage," Kyle said. "Of the kid in the alley. I watched it 3 times. I wanted to be wrong about what I was seeing. I wasn't." He paused. "I defended you. I had actual arguments I made to people who brought it up. I said you weren't that kind of officer. I said you'd been under pressure. I said people didn't understand how hard the job was." His voice remained level throughout, and the levelness was more devastating than anything else could have been. And then I ran out of arguments. And what was left was just the footage. Kyle Pruitt started. "I'm not here for a conversation, Dad." Kyle's voice was not unkind. It was simply certain. "I'm here because I needed you to see my face when I said that the name is gone, that I'm not carrying it, that wherever you go from here it doesn't have my name attached to it." He paused. "I'm getting married next spring. My fiancé's family is in Seattle. They're good people." Another pause. "My stepfather mom's already met someone. It's early, but it seems steady. He's a good man." She laughs. I hadn't heard her laugh like that in a long time. Pruitt's hand on the handset was very still. "I'm not coming back," Kyle said. "I want you to know that, so you don't wait for it. You should know what things actually are even when they're hard." He looked at his father through the glass for a moment longer with an expression that contained, if you looked very carefully, something that was not hate and not forgiveness and not indifference. Something more like grief, the specific grief of someone who loved a person and discovered too completely to ignore that the person was not what they had believed them to be. He set the handset on the cradle. He stood up. He walked out of the visitation room without looking back. Pruitt sat in the booth for a moment. Then he raised his free hand and knocked on the glass, not in the urgent, theatrical way of scenes he had watched in courtroom dramas, but in the small, futile way of someone who simply cannot accept that a door is closed. He knocked twice. The sound was absorbed by the glass and the plastic and the thick institutional air of the visitation room, and it went nowhere. The corrections officer at the far end of the room said, "Visiting period is over for booth 7. Please return the handset." Pruitt returned the handset. He was walked back to Building C, Unit 7, and the door of his cell closed behind him with the same metallic finality that doors close with in places like this, not dramatically, not harshly, just completely, the sound of a space becoming sealed again. He sat on his bunk, and he looked at the wall in front of him, and he thought about the navy hoodie on the morning of a gray Tuesday in a city where it had been raining, and he thought about the handcuff key falling on the linoleum, and he thought about his son's face through thick glass saying a name he had never heard before. Kyle Manders. The name settled into the room and stayed there. It was not a name Pruitt recognized. It was a name that belonged to a person who had chosen to be his own creation rather than his father's continuation. And there was, in the honesty of his cell at Sheridan, on a spring evening with 26.5 years remaining on his sentence, nothing Pruitt could do with that fact except hold it. He held it for a very long time. 4 months after the verdict on a Friday afternoon in early spring, when the Portland sky had decided for once to be something other than gray, and was producing a mild, genuine sunlight that made the city's considerable beauty briefly visible. Dara Osei drove herself to a coffee shop in northeast Portland and ordered a chamomile tea at the counter, and sat down at a small table near the window to wait. She was wearing civilian clothes, jeans, a light jacket, a pair of reading glasses she didn't need in this light but had forgotten she was wearing. She had a folder with her, and in the folder were 2 documents, and the documents were the reason for this meeting, and she had been looking forward to this meeting with an anticipation she rarely allowed herself regarding the outcomes of her cases. She was not supposed to have favorites. She did not think she had favorites. But she thought that if she were pushed, she would admit that some conclusions felt more like justice than others, and that this particular conclusion fell into that category. Dayon Ferris came in at 3 minutes past 2. He had taken the bus she knew because he had mentioned it in passing when they confirmed the meeting the day before. The way you mention incidental logistics without emphasis, and she had heard it and thought about the car and the scholarship, and the way one deliberate injustice rippled outward into 1,000 smaller deprivations over years. He was wearing a clean flannel shirt and carrying a small notebook. He looked, compared to the man she had sat beside on a curb in Gresham 8 months earlier, different in a way she couldn't immediately attribute to any single change, less braced maybe. Less arranged for impact. He sat down across from her. He ordered a coffee from the server who came over. "How are classes?" Dara asked. "Hard," he said, and then immediately after a smile that was entirely genuine and surprised her by its completeness, "But I'm current. I'm actually current. I went back in January and I was terrified I'd be completely behind. And I'm not. My advisor." She was my advisor 3 years ago, too. She said it was like I'd never left, which is either a compliment or she doesn't remember me. "She remembers you," Dara said. "Maybe." He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. "I'm taking 2 extra credits this term to get back on track for the graduation timeline. It's a lot. It's..." Yeah, it's a lot. But it's good a lot. Dara opened the folder and placed the first document on the table between them. It was on official letterhead from the City of Portland and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Western District of Oregon, and it was for $1. $8 million in wrongful conviction damages, the settlement amount that the city's legal department and her office had negotiated jointly, approved by the city council on a 7-2 vote after a 2-hour closed-door session, during which she had been told a majority of council members had watched the buffer recording from the body cam and the session had ended early. Dion looked at the check. He did not pick it up immediately. He looked at the number and the letterhead and the date, and he looked at them for long enough that Dara could see him actually reading them. Not the instinctive skim of someone who has received paperwork before, but the careful word-by-word reading of someone who wants to be certain that the words say what they appear to say. Then she placed the second document. It was on Portland State University letterhead. It reinstated his enrollment in the Massey College of Engineering and Computer Science, credited him with all academic hours from his previous enrollment, recognized his scholarship as continuous under the exception provision for wrongful conviction, and confirmed his admission to the spring cohort. He read that one too. Both of these are real, he said. It was not quite a question. Both of these are real, she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. He picked up the letter from Portland State and held it in both hands, looking at it. His hands were not shaking exactly. They had the faint tremor of someone holding something very still that requires some effort to hold still. He set it down carefully, as if it were something that could be damaged. "I've been accepted to the accelerated engineering track," he said. "My advisor put me in for it. If I keep pace with the credit load, I can graduate in 2 years." "I know," Dara said. "I heard from her office." He looked at her. "Your advisor," Dara said, "sent my office a letter when she heard the conviction had been vacated. She asked whether there was a mechanism for expedited reapplication. I sent her paperwork about the wrongful conviction scholarship restoration provision." A pause. "She's a very organized person." Dion was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why did you come yourself that day in Gresham? You didn't have to do that personally. You could have sent someone." Dara considered the question. She had been asked it before in different forms by different people. She gave Dion the answer she thought was most true. "Because I needed you to understand the difference," she said, "between the institution and the people inside it who are still fighting. And the only way to communicate that was in person. Not in a letter, and not through a representative." She paused. "I also needed to understand you. I'd been building a case around what happened to you for months. I needed to meet the person in the middle of it." He nodded slowly. "What are you going to do with it?" he said, gesturing at the check. Not what are you going to tell me to do? Just, what do you think someone does with $1.8 million that came from—" He stopped. "From all of this? I think you do what you said you wanted to do," Dara said. "I think you become the kind of engineer who builds things that work for people who have been told the system doesn't work for them. I think you become the kind of person who remembers specifically and in detail what it costs when power decides to treat someone as if they're nothing. And I think you use that memory the way I use it, as the thing that tells you what work actually matters." Dion looked out the window at the spring afternoon. The street outside was ordinary and unhurried people. Going places, a delivery truck double-parked a woman with a stroller pausing to look at a window display. The specific, unremarkable texture of a city going about its business. "Thank you for believing me," he said. "I know you'll say you were just doing your job." "I was doing my job," Dara said. "That doesn't mean it wasn't also the right thing. Both can be true." She left first. She picked up her folder, thanked the server, and walked out into the spring afternoon. She did not look back through the window at Dion sitting at the table with the Portland State letter in his hands, though she knew without looking that he was there, and that he was reading it again, and that some particular tension he had been carrying in his shoulders, in the careful arrangement of his body against the expectation of impact, was for the first time in 3 years beginning to release. She walked to her car. It was a good afternoon. 2 years after the verdict, Dara Osei was confirmed as a federal appellate judge for the 9th Circuit Court of Appeals. On her last day as United States Attorney, a Thursday in January reigning in the characteristic Portland way that had come to feel over her time there. Less like weather and more like atmosphere, she drove herself to the 6th Precinct one final time. The front desk was staffed, the interior gate was secured and required a badge. The captain's office had a new name on the door. Acting Captain M. Torres, Interim Commander, 6th District. The bulletin board outside the roll call room carried a printed photograph of 8 officers and 12 teenagers at a community cleanup event in the northeast quadrant, rakes and trash bags, and the particular uncomfortable cheerfulness of people who are trying something new and finding it more natural than they expected. Standing in the center of the photograph holding a rake and talking to a kid in a Portland Trail Blazers hoodie was Sergeant Connor Feld. He saw Dara from across the bullpen and walked over and shook her hand and said simply, "It's different in here now." She nodded. She could feel that it was. Inside Federal Correctional Institution, Sheridan inmate number 31847 marked another day. He had developed in the 2 years of his sentence the habits of an institutional life, a routine around meals and count, and the specific economy of managing days inside a closed system. He had lost the last of the weight that the trial had stripped from him and had not regained it. He did not think about the case in the ways he had initially thought about it. The injustice of it, the narrative in which he was the wronged party, because those thoughts had worn out. What remained in the quiet of the cell at night was simpler and harder. The memory of the hoodie, the memory of the handcuff key falling, the memory of the word nothing in his own voice captured and played back in a federal courtroom. He did not have a name for what he was doing with those memories. He did not have the vocabulary for the territory he was in. He had 25 years left to develop it. Deon Ferris graduated on a Saturday in June in the Massey College commencement ceremony at Portland State University, wearing his engineering hood over a white button-down shirt. His mother was in the front row. She had traveled from Memphis and she had brought his grandmother, and together they made enough noise for 10 people when his name was called. After the ceremony on the steps outside the arena in the June sunshine, a reporter from the Portland Tribune who had covered the Pruitt trial asked him whether he had anything to say about the case. Deon thought about this for a moment, genuinely thought about it, tilting his head slightly, the way he did when he was working through an engineering problem that had more than one right answer. Then he said, "I don't think about him anymore. I think about what I'm building." He shook the reporter's hand and walked back to his mother, who took his face in both hands and said something that the reporter was too far away to hear. Whatever it was, it made Deon laugh, a full, easy, unguarded laugh that reached his eyes and his shoulders, and that was for anyone watching simply a young man on a good day ready for the next thing. If this story of justice, dignity, and the power of one woman's quiet courage resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel. We release new stories every week. And leave us a comment. What moment in this story stayed with you the longest? We read every single one.